you, Arlene, and a big thank you for all that you've personally done, and you will continue to do as chairman of Intertrade UK, which is a very important one of these bodies that will monitor the Windsor framework and ensure that trade flows within the UK are not disrupted and indeed expanded. So John talked a lot about the geopolitical and geostrategic battleground, if you will, in the world, and referenced the challenges that we have in particular with Iran, Russia, China, and North Korea. What I'm going to talk about to start with are the geoeconomic challenges that we face in the world, and the context for this. And I will bring this gradually down to the level of trade within the UK, and particularly the recently negotiated Windsor framework and Northern Ireland's role in the UK. But I want to start by talking about the real threat that we face in geoeconomic terms, which is a battle for the world's operating system, its economic operating system. So what does that mean? It means that there is a battle between countries that essentially run themselves based on government intervention, state-owned companies, state distortion of the economy, for where the commercial sector and the government sector are essentially fused. Now, you will all recognise most probably that I'm talking about China, but I'm not only talking about China. There are many countries that operate in that way. If we are to have a world that continues to build on the successes of the 1947 to 2000 and let's say 6 period, where we massively increased global GDP per capita, where we managed to reduce the number of people living on less than $1.25 a day to 0. It's actually climbing now, but if we're able to generate and create wealth, if the world is able to generate and create wealth in that way, that is going to benefit obviously all of us. We've looked and we've modelled in the Growth Commission, which I co-chair, the impact of distortion, state-led companies, government distortions, government interventions, all of those things. We've modelled this, and we found that if the UK were to improve by about 15% the quality of its domestic competitive regulatory landscape, i.e. more competition, that would be by itself an injection of about 13% of GDP per capita into the UK economy from a state to state. So it's not every year, but it's just however long it takes you to get that 15% increase. And it's similar for international trade, and it's similar for property right protection. Those three things, domestic competition, openness of your international trade regime, and protection of property rights, where do they come from? They come from many of the cultural aspects that Arlene talked about. They come from things like our common law. They come from our approach to rule of law. They come from the fact that we regulate. Our approach to regulation is very much a competition-based approach to regulation for the most part. So there's a lot to play for. If you add this all up, you know, we're talking about a radically different and much richer country in the UK if we're able to get this right. And just to give you a sort of bit of negative context, last year was the first year where the state of Mississippi, which is the poorest US state, became richer than the UK. So if we were to be a state of the United States, we would be the poorest state of the United States, and that's with the City of London. So you can imagine without the City of London where we would be. And there has been a gradual 25-year erosion and stalling of our GDP per capita in the UK. So these are urgent issues. We need to, we cannot afford to continue doing what we have done. We need to do more. And I'm going to talk about three critical areas where, if we get this right, we could get that. In total, if you look at all those 3 different areas, you're talking about a potential for £20,000 more per UK household. So this is a big prize. So if we are going to achieve this prize, if we're going to win this prize, there are certain things that we have to do. And I was an advisor to the Secretary of State. I was also an advisor to USTR. And if I were advising the incoming government, I would say Prime Minister and Cabinet, these are the 3 things that you need to do to A, close the gap with the US in terms of GDP per capita. Bear in mind that 25 years ago, a British family visiting their American friends doing the same type of job, living the same type of life, were roughly about the same same GDP per capita, roughly, give or take 10%. Now, there are US states where that same family doing the same job, living the same life, literally the American family is 100% richer, 100%. That's without even thinking about the decreased cost of living, which is borne out by things like the electricity cost in the US being 18 cents per kilowatt hour, the electricity cost in the UK being 51 cents per kilowatt hour. So very high cost of living, very low income is what we need to change. And there are 3 things that I think we can do to do that change. And I would recommend on the trade side, we've had some successes here in the last few years. We've acceded to the CPTPP, which is the Comprehensive and Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership, which is the most important regional trade agreement based on regulatory recognition and not regulatory harmonization in the world. It is growing, it is adding members, it's a significant amount of global GDP, and it is growing faster than other areas of the world. If we're going to win this battle for the world's operating system, and when I say we're going to win, I mean the coalition of allies that John talked about, essentially. And it starts with the US and the UK. It starts with the Atlantic Declaration. It builds into AUKUS, Pillar 2, including Australia, and it builds into the Hiroshima Accord with Japan. So that's the core group that has to win this, and then we build more into regional agreements like the CPTPP and so on. So CPTPP is a good news story for the UK, and thankfully, I don't think I don't think there's any political party that would change that trajectory of maintaining our position in the CPTPP. The second thing is, again, what John mentioned in terms of the relationship with the US and building on the Atlantic Declaration, and actually building an advanced, liberalized trade agreement with the US. This is incredibly important. It was a pivotal element of the UK strategy. For reasons that were not within our control, the US decided that they didn't want to do, President Biden decided he didn't want to do a trade agreement. Not with the UK, he didn't want to do a trade agreement with anybody. So trade policy in the US is stuck at the moment. But there are things that we can do with the US, there are things that we can build on with the US. We do need to improve the UK-EU free trade agreement, and we can. There's a lot in the UK-EU trade agreement that can be improved in terms of more mutual recognition agreements, building on the customs and trade facilitation parts of the agreement. But there are some things that I would advise the incoming Prime Minister and Cabinet not to do. The first thing I would say not to do, and bear in mind that the Labour manifesto is no customs union and no internal market, but I would say be very careful about any kind of dynamic alignment of regulation. It may be very tempting, and your private sector, your large companies are all going to come to you and they're going to say, And you're going to ask them, what do you want? And they're going to say, just align us to European regulation. We don't want to have all these different regulations that we have to deal with. And first of all, your job as Prime Minister and Cabinet is not to do what the one particular group of incumbent large companies wants you to do. Your job is to argue for what is best for the UK economy, UK business, UK consumers, UK businesses of the future. And the problems with dynamic regulatory alignment is if we do that, we're no longer in control of our regulatory system. We've ceded control to another party in another court system, and it's very difficult to maintain our position in the CPTPP, for example, let alone a US deal or any other deal, if you're not in control of your own regulatory environment. What most of our trading partners want from the UK, and when I spoke to ambassadors in Geneva when we initially had just left the EU, and they were very excited and said, well, so now we've got a big G7 country that's going to adopt pro-competitive regulation. It's going to diverge from the European system of regulation. They are now doubting which side of the table we're actually going to be on. And one of the most important things they want from the UK is ability to improve our goods regulation. So it isn't a case of saying goods can be aligned and we'll do lots of services agreements. That's not what people want. That's not what countries actually want, and we won't do any trade deals with them on that basis. We might talk a lot, but we won't do any trade deals because we need to have that flexibility over our goods regulation. But what I would say to incumbent businesses that don't want to deal with multiple sets of regulation is there is no reason why the UK can't unilaterally recognise European standards and rules. It is very difficult to imagine the UK ever being more restrictive and more anti-competitive than the EU's regulatory structure, and therefore if we simply unilaterally recognised that if a UK firm wants to manufacture to European standards for the internal UK market, that's fine, they can do that. It is up to the government, it's up to the UK government to create a sufficiently pro-competitive regulatory environment that businesses are motivated to want to satisfy that environment. And when you negotiate with the US and other countries, when they want to export to your market, they will want to satisfy your better pro-competitive regulation. And ultimately, if your regulation and European regulation are sufficiently different, so your regulation is sufficiently better, then what will happen is what happens in Australia in the beef sector, for example, where the Australians will have two separate lines, one for what they call the closed loop European market, and one for rest of world. So they'll manufacture on that basis, and it makes economic sense for them to do that. If you're not much different from Europe, it wouldn't make much sense to do that, but this will actually allow us to be more pro-competitive and reap some of those benefits. So it's very important, and in fact regulatory reform is the biggest benefit. It is the biggest area of GDP per capita gain, roughly double the gains you can get domestic regulation compared with international trade. Everyone thinks about trade as the big thing, but it's domestic regulation where your biggest economic gains actually come. And then the third thing that you have to do is manage the disruption. We have left the customs union, we have left the internal market of the EU. There is inevitably disruption, and in some places, which I'll come on to, we see it more strongly than others. But we can manage that disruption. I'm reminded of something that the current Chief Trade Negotiator Advisor of the UK, Permanent Secretary Sir Crawford Faulkner, said early on in this process. He could not get his head around the fact that we would forego all of these important opportunities, not just opportunities for the UK on trade and on domestic regulation, but opportunities to be a major player, a major G7 nation, affecting that regulatory battlefield that's going on in the world and therefore contributing to enhanced global GDP per capita. We'd forego all of this because we're afraid of a customs form. He could not get his head around that. And we've spent the last 8 years worrying about how to make the customs process easier, which is a legitimate thing to worry about, but we have to see it in the context that it falls into. So how do we manage disruption at the border? I would say there's 3 things that we want to focus on. One is more mutual recognition with the EU. We don't have any mutual recognition at all with the EU, which is pretty extraordinary given our trading patterns and also considering our where we start from in terms of the differences between our regulation, and we haven't changed very much. They have actually ironically changed more than we have changed. So there's a significant amount of mutual recognition that we need to get from the EU and the UK trade and cooperation agreement. Where Europe subsidizes or distorts its market, and that damages our traders, far from the level playing field provisions of the agreement being a threat to the UK, we should use them. I'm always amused by farmers in the UK who are worried about Australian exports under the Australia FTA, beef and lamb and so on from New Zealand. And I would say, well, okay, so you've got Irish exports of beef coming into the UK, tariff-free, quota-free, no rules at all. In fact, we don't even put SPS controls on them. So why aren't you worried about that? And that's 80% of the market, and you're worrying about 2% of Australian beef over here. So we need to ensure that we get more mutual recognition. We use the customs simplifications that exist already in the world to use more digitized trade. We're currently doing a project in Anglesey in the port of Holyhead, which is a free port, to produce a digital trade corridor where you want to reduce this customs process as close as you can to ordering stuff on Amazon, which can be done. It requires a lot of work, but it can be done and it can be agreed with the EU. So things like digital trade corridors, these sorts of things, trade facilitations are very, very powerful tools that will make it much easier for traders to trade across borders. And then finally, Northern Ireland. I've spent probably the last 8 years of my life, most of which has been spent dealing with the problem in Northern Ireland, because we knew that that would be the most difficult challenge that the UK leaving the EU would present. We have now got an agreement with the EU, the Windsor Framework, on trade between GB and Northern Ireland. But this can also be improved. And we have to remember in our negotiations with the EU with respect to Northern Ireland that for us, Northern Ireland is always going to be existential. For them, it will become less and less important over time. And things that we might not have been able to get a year ago, in 3 years we will be able to get. And now we have these bodies like the Implementation Monitoring Board, your UK Intertrade, that can look at how the Windsor Framework is working. What the EU is very good at saying is, tell us if it's not working. So we will be able to tell them where it doesn't work, how it can be improved. And having run the system that moves 50,000 traders between GB and Northern Ireland, I can tell you that very small changes in the Windsor Framework can make very big effects in terms of making it easier. And essentially what we have to do to give Northern Ireland the economic future that I think it can have, and for it to become an economic generator for the UK, we need to make sure that goods moving between GB and Northern Ireland that are staying in the internal market of the UK have a much, much smoother and easier ride than goods that are moving at risk of going into Ireland. The Windsor Framework I would regard as the first step, only the first step in that process, and there are many steps that we need to take to make it progressively easier and easier to do that. Because if we can do that, then Northern Ireland is in a very extraordinary position, which no one intended it, I think, at the beginning of this process to be in. But it is in a position where if you are manufacturing anywhere in Europe or the UK, and you want to reach the GB and Irish and European market, the best place to put your manufacturing facility is Northern Ireland. And that becomes even more important if you are dealing with products where tariffs are high. So there's a whole range of manufacturing facilities that we are talking to about moving to Northern Ireland to take advantage of this. And in terms of the guarantee of the Union and Northern Ireland's place in the Union, there's nothing better than that kind of prosperity to guarantee its place in the Union. And the fact that it also is intimately connected through these trade routes to Cairn Ryan, to Scotland, and through the trade that moves from Northern Ireland to Ireland into GB, through Holyhead Port, through Anglesey, through Wales, that connector between Northern Ireland, Wales and Scotland of trucks that are constantly cycling, back and forth, is critical to trade between Northern Ireland and Great Britain, and so Northern Ireland benefits from all of that, but it also benefits from the UK's trade agreement. So if all of these things I talked about, US deal, CPTPP, services agreements, all of those things, if I'm a financial services company in Belfast, I benefit from all of those things. Whereas my goods manufacturer down the road benefits from having tariff-free, process-free access to GB and to the EU. So we need to make the most of that. We need to think more of Northern Ireland in the UK. We need to think more of Northern Ireland and certain other places like the free ports in Wales, the free ports in Scotland. We need to think of them more as economic generators for the country. I think we tend to, in the UK, in the centre, we tend to think of them as Barnett formula. We think of the cost, but they are not. They are in fact potential economic dynamos for the UK, and we are not that far away, I think, in getting that reality to be in place. And that will all drive UK GDP, and that will drive what I talked about at the beginning, which is closing the gap on other countries in terms of GDP per capita and giving our people a better quality of life. So that's what I would say to the incoming Prime Minister and Cabinet. I'm not sure they would implement how much of that they would implement. But I'll close by saying the rest of the world has been watching and continues to watch this process. When I was in Geneva with WTO ambassadors, they were very excited about the prospect that there was a G7 country that was going to diverge, was going to be pro-competitive, was going to unlock all the trade problems that had afflicted the world since the Seattle Trade Ministerial in 1999. They're still waiting, they're still hoping, and the stakes, if anything, have become much, much higher, even in the last 8 years. The stakes in energy, the stakes in war, the stakes have become very high. And if we get this wrong, I just remind you of a sort of axiom that I tend to tell all my the people who come and work for me. Number one, the natural state of man is not prosperity and peace. It is violence, conflict, and poverty. We have to work very hard to change that. Throughout the history of mankind, we've got this unique period from 1947 to 2006 when we've actually got it right. That happens when wealth is created. Wealth is very hard to create and very easy to destroy, and competition is the only force we know that actually creates it. If you can't unlock the forces of competition in your domestic regulation, in your trade system, in the way you operate, you're going to destroy wealth. And so I would close by saying it's very easy to talk about wealth creation and say it's very important. Great, I'm glad people are talking about it. But there are some very specific things that you need to do to get it, and they're very hard to do. And the people who don't want things to change are extremely powerful, which I suspect the new government will soon discover. And I'll close there. If there are questions, happy to take those. Happy to talk more about the Windsor Framework if you'd like.
Jason? Jason?
I was going to ask about protectionism
Mm.
and in terms specifically relating to the farming sector.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not expressing a personal view, just a generalistic view. There are forces within the UK that say that the Australia-New Zealand deal on farming, etc., is bad, especially in Wales. That's what some believe in the farming industry. I'm not from a farming background, but what would be your analysis of saying, hey, the deal with Australia and New Zealand to ship foods from that part of the world over to the United Kingdom market, and then the forces here saying, hey, it's bad for Welsh farming. Well, what would be your
response?
Yeah, please.
Yeah, so I am a member of the Trade and Agriculture Commission, but I'm not speaking on behalf of the Trade and Agriculture Commission now. But I would commend you to look at the Trade and Agriculture Commission report on the Australia and New Zealand deal, because we did extensive work on looking at what the impacts of these deals actually would be on the UK. And what people often forget, and I mentioned this before, is the elephant in the room is tariff-free, quota-free access that European, remember we are an importer of those beef, lamb, etc., those kind of agricultural commodities. And we import them primarily from the EU. And the EU has a tremendous advantage because of the tariff-free, quota-free access, no SBS controls, no regulatory controls. So those exporters like Australia and New Zealand are facing a huge competitive challenge to overcome that market, which is why if you look at the economics, there's not really that much of a threat. If you're worried about imports, you'd be worried about European imports, not other country imports. But I also think there's an important other element here, which is because we tend to get into these very mercantilist arguments when we talk about trade, and actually there are huge opportunities for protein delivery through very good UK agricultural primary products producers around the world. So one of the things that we need to be doing is integrating our farmers into global supply chains, because our farmers have been out of global supply chains. When you have a very high protective tariff, as the Europeans do, with a massive subsidy, you're inside that market, you are not exposed to global supply chains at all. So again, remember what I said about competition. This is the opposite of that. So consequently, one of the things I think we need to do is reintegrate our farming community into global supply chains. And we have a very good example of this. In New Zealand in the 1980s, I don't know if anyone remembers being in New Zealand in the 1980s or the 1970s. New Zealand was a basket case country in the 1970s. It was desperately poor. Its agricultural sector was a disaster. Its dairy sector was a disaster. Now, when the UK left the EU and joined the EU, lost the New Zealand lost its privileged access, and they had to do some significant things. But they did those significant things, and the result of it is that the New Zealand dairy sector is so successful that while it produced only 1% of the world's milk, it controls 30% of the world's dairy. 30%. And they picked the most lucrative bits of that supply chain. It's a really complex supply chain. New Zealand lamb, 115 cuts of meat. So we're not very sophisticated compared to some farming communities, and we need to introduce them. And the benefit of all this is that there's a massive market for protein around the world, in the Middle East, in developing countries and so on, where people are coming out of poverty. What do they do when they come out of poverty? They start consuming large amounts of protein, and we can deliver it to them. And there are far more benefits from doing that and coming together through these agreements to do that. But we have to, I think, help our farmers to get out of a sort of defensive crouch when it comes to trade deals and just see the opportunities that actually exist. And what I found is when you do present them those opportunities, they are as entrepreneurial and as good at seeking out new markets as anybody else.
Graham Gudgeon first. I'll come to you next, Mark.
Thanks very much. Thanks very much for that presentation, Shanker. If I understood you correctly, you seem to be arguing that dual access for Northern Ireland into both EU and GB markets is an advantage, and firms are queuing up to get into Northern Ireland as a result. But I find that a little hard to understand. If you compare the situation now with when the UK was inside the EU, then Northern Ireland's access to the EU and GB markets is the same for exporters. The only real difference is it's a bit harder to import into Northern Ireland from GB and some other places. So the situation's got a little more difficult for Northern Ireland, not tremendously so, but somewhat. So in that context, why would firms who didn't come into Northern Ireland when we were part of the EU now think it's such a big advantage to do so?
Yeah, so probably best to answer that looking at a couple of case studies. So if you think about a manufacturer of products that are where very high tariffs apply to those products, and I apologise for there's going to be a bit of technicality here, but manufacturers of goods that have very high tariffs. In the past, prior to the UK leaving the EU, you could manufacture those anywhere in the European Union and there wouldn't be a tariff, there wouldn't be anything. Not every market in the EU is the same size or the same value. And for a lot of those products, which tends to be in food and textiles and so on, UK prices are quite high and quite attractive, and it's quite a good market. So if I'm a producer in the Far East and I want to now access the UK market, or let's say the GB market, because it's got high prices and it's a big market. I want to also access the European market. Where would I build my manufacturing facility? Well, I could build my manufacturing facility in Poland, and I would be able to access the EU market tariff-free, process-free. But in reaching the GB market, I would have process. I could put my manufacturing facility in GB, and then I have process from GB into Europe, and I potentially have tariffs if there's an anti-dumping case, and we operate differently. Plus, I have regulatory barriers into EU. I could put my manufacturing facility in Northern Ireland, and by the way, if I'm in GB and I'm selling product into Northern Ireland, because of something called the secondary movement rule, that tariff that was now zero because of the EU-UK trade agreement, actually I can't take the benefit of. So I might suddenly have to pay a 50% tariff to get that product into Northern Ireland. So if on the other hand, I put my manufacturing facility in Northern Ireland, I never have to worry about a secondary movement tariff. I can sell in GB without tariff or process, and I can sell in Europe without tariff or process. So it's a huge advantage if, and you're right to highlight the if, it's a huge advantage if the raw materials, because Arlene's right about the trade flows between GB and it's about 5 to 1. What critically needs to happen is that the raw materials that the Northern Ireland manufacturer, want to use to produce my product, I need to be able to get them easily from GB, and that's where the problem at the moment is. And that's what we need to fix, because if we can fix that, then it is in the current framework where there are tariffs and there are barriers, and I haven't even talked about rules of origin, but there are significant issues. Northern Ireland doesn't have any of those issues. So the critical thing we have to do is make sure we get those products that move from GB to NI to move as easily as we can. And I would say, I'm not suggesting that the Windsor framework is a stunning success on that front. But what I am saying is it's the first step. And it does need to be built on, and if we were to freeze it in place and not do anything at all about it, then I don't think that would be a great success. But But I think we need to deliver this, because if we can deliver this in a stable way, then I think companies will do that. Will take advantage of that.
Mark Seddon.
Thank you, Andrew, and thanks very much indeed for your presentation. I run the Centre for UN Studies here at Buckingham, and there's a big proportion of the students here who are from the Commonwealth, and last month we had the Foreign Minister of Ghana come to visit, who is the candidate to be the most likely next Secretary General of the Commonwealth, and frankly should be a great improvement on the incumbent. But I just listening to you, I mean, and listening to Ambassador Bolton, there's a kind of Anglo-American push to so much of the talk about trade. But when we talk about global Britain, and part of the reason for leaving the EU was for global Britain, why are we not doing more thinking about the Commonwealth? Not for old-fashioned reasons or whatever, but obviously there are practical and familial and language and cultural, but so much we have in common. But because if you look at many of the economies, Singapore, Malaysia, India, South Africa, Nigeria, Canada, Australia, we've mentioned those. But why don't they seem to figure more in UK thinking? And just one final thing to add to that, as we probably all know, citizens from the Commonwealth, or whose families originally came from the Commonwealth, tend to be great supporters of the United Kingdom. So perhaps we should be thinking a bit more about the Commonwealth and trade.
Yeah, no, it's a good question. I think if you look at the CPTPP, for example, most of those countries, or at least half of those countries, Malaysia, Singapore, Australia, Canada, New Zealand, are Commonwealth countries. And I don't think that's a coincidence. I think the Commonwealth countries, because of English rule of law, because of, frankly, what the British were able to sort of give in terms of institution building and so on, there is no doubt, and I can say this as a Commonwealth, as a sort of child of the Commonwealth myself, there's no doubt that there is a sort of Commonwealth effect. In other words, the peer group of Commonwealth countries outperform their peer group by about 15%. So poorer African countries, Commonwealth countries outperform non-Commonwealth African countries about 15%. Same is true when you go right up to the top. So I do think that we are kind of doing what you're suggesting at one level, which is the sort of Australias and the New Zealands and so on. Where I think we need to spend a bit more time, frankly, is the sort of African Commonwealth and the development approaches, which I think we do achieve more through trade than development assistance, development aid. So I would want to see more of that focus, and we did have economic partnership agreements and so forth with those countries, and of course the Commonwealth country that falls in between those is India, and that is the country that we are negotiating right now a free trade agreement with. And ironically, it's a bit amusing actually, both manifestos of both parties have said we will complete an FTA. It's the only country we've actually said we will complete an FTA. I mean, I think the Indians may have something to say about that, but that intention is the right intention, and it is very possible that the UK could negotiate the sort of deal with India that nobody else has really been able to do. Not because we have a historical tie or any of those things, but because we have very focused offensive interests with India. It's basically legal services access, financial services access, Scotch whisky. Those are our very, very focused interests. And we have fairly loose defensive interests. And what the Indians primarily want is Mode 4 services, which is basically if I'm an IT company in Bangalore and I want to set up an office in the UK, I want my executive to be able to move easily back and forth. That's not a big problem. So for some of these reasons, I think that we could get a deal with India. And if we do get a deal with India, then we have a Commonwealth. We do have a Commonwealth strategy, I think. But we also need to be very clear about why we're doing economic partnership agreements and so forth with particularly the African Commonwealth countries and Africa generally, because while we have not done anything, and I say we collectively, the West, have not done anything, China and Russia are pouring into those countries, well, they have poured into those countries. And Xi Jinping said recently that the Chinese approach has always been, in the past, has always been, leave us alone. We have our economic system, you have your economic system. We're not going to tell anyone, you know, they have to follow ours, but leave us alone. Now, as of about February of this year, Xi Jinping is saying very clearly, our economic system is better than yours. And in fact, you African countries should adopt the Chinese system. You should have state-owned companies. You should have these kinds of distortions and disruptions. And if that continues, what will happen is it will impoverish ultimately the countries in Africa. So we have to step up to the plate, and we have to do something, and we have to have alternatives to Belt and Road and other initiatives that they have. And we have to offer, and it has to work. You know, what we offer them has to work. You know, it has to actually generate wealth for them. And that's why some of the things we are doing ourselves, the US and Europe, are so disruptive. So carbon border adjustment mechanism is incredibly destructive to developing countries. The IRA bill in the US and a lot of the stuff around the government intervention and the discussion that's going on in the US is very disruptive and damaging to developing countries who need to get into global supply chains. If you keep them out of global supply chains, we are only giving them one alternative. You know, they will have to go to China, and ultimately that's a big problem. And we have to win hearts and minds in those countries. If you go to rooms like this and you talk as John Bolton did about Ukraine, everyone agrees. Everyone is in splendid agreement. In the US and the UK, mostly in the US, are in agreement. But if you go to Africa, Latin America, Asia, this is an internal European conflict which we don't care about. And that's just the reality. And you look at what India's doing, you look at what China's doing with regard to Russia on this. You know, we have to show them that, as Liam Fox said at one point, and I make no apology for saying this, we have to show them that our system is better. It actually is better. It actually will lift people out of poverty. It will actually generate growth and jobs and a better quality of life. And it has to work. And we can't therefore do things that damage that. And unfortunately, we sadly are.
Shanker, thank you so much. Shanker,